Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome back three scholars of education history, Dr. Gonzalo Guzmán, Dr. Philis Barragán-Goetz, and Dr. Laura Muñoz for a look at Mexican American teachers and educational achievement. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, everybody. Good to see you again.
It's my pleasure to be here with all of you.
Wonderful. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about our guests, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for their presentations. So Dr. Guzmán is an assistant professor at Macalester College. His research focuses on the racialization and educational histories of Latinx communities in the Mountain States and Pacific Northwest of the United States. And of course, Philis, who's been with us several times now, so good to see you again, is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. She researches and teaches classes in Mexican American history, women's history and gender history, Texas history, and U.S. social and cultural history. And we have Dr. Muñoz, Laura Muñoz, with us, Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She teaches the people and histories of Mexican American, Chicanx, and Latinx communities in the United States, with an emphasis on race, gender, and education in the American West. So wonderful to have this body of scholars with us who specialize specifically in the history of education, something that is important to our community and has always been important to our community. And you've been documenting the ways that this history has always, that education has always been important to our community. So it's always such a pleasure to see the three of you. So let me, I think we're going to pass it over to, I believe, Dr. Guzmán, are you kicking off?
Am I?
I thought
You're choosing. I'm totally. I am
okay.
good. Oh.
Well, we can say whoever wants to go first. I know everybody's doing such amazing work. So tonight's conversation is going to kind of bring us up to speed on some of your recent research. So actually, what I'm going to do is put a link to a previous conversation we had with the three of you in the chat. So if anybody missed that previous conversation, you can catch up on that later. But tonight we're going to hear about some new work that is coming from the three of these scholars. So who does want to go first? All right, well, first we'll start with our local scholar. Wonderful. Okay, so let me pull up your presentation real quick, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, so hi, everyone. Thank you all so much to my friends and my colleagues, Laura and Gonzalo, for being on this panel with me. And thank you so much to MACRI for organizing us and for all of the incredible and really necessary work that they do. And of course, to everybody out there who may be watching and listening right now. So my talk today is called Emilia Dávila and the Legacy of El Colegio Altamirano. Colegio Altamirano was one of the most well-known escuelitas, not only in Texas, but throughout the Southwest. It was even well-known in Mexico. So escuelitas are ethnic Mexican little schools from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s were a community-driven phenomenon that were created by local populations to meet the needs that those very populations were experiencing. And so for at least a century, they both, there are these larger historical developments that directly influenced the history of escuelitas, like progressivism, modernization, public education, the Mexican Revolution, and the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. And throughout all of these eras and movements, ethnic Mexicans faced numerous obstacles to educating their children, some of which we're going to talk about today. The next slide, please. So the National Bureau of after the Civil War, the National Bureau of Education did this study of public education in the country, and they could only locate one public school building in all of Texas and no state-supported schools. Of course, there were escuelitas and there were parochial schools, but as far as public schools were concerned, they could only identify one. And So Texas made a serious effort to build more schools throughout the 1880s. And that development was definitely initiated by or influenced by the progressive education movement, right? And the first sign that the progressive education movement arrived in Texas was as early as 1884 with the school reform bill from that year, which sought to create an educational bureaucracy that did a number of things: consolidated schools, required teacher certification, and outlawed instruction in any other language other than English. So in a lot of ways, that with that 1884 school reform bill, you have the roots of our present day public education system. Now, it took decades, like decades, for these reforms to yield a robust public school system. And then you have some other reforms. In 1915, the state passed its first compulsory school law. There was another English-only bill in 1918. And so in theory, these reforms may seem productive and even benign maybe in practice, but by the 1910s, they were the progressive strategies that blossomed into the educationally violent tactics of race-based segregation, English-only instruction, and an Anglo-centric and vocational curriculum for ethnic Mexicans, all of which reinforced the anti-Mexican violence that was taking place in the early part of the 20th century. Next slide, please. So well before the rise of the public school system in the 1880s, escuelitas existed in nearly every settlement across South Texas. And with that, I'm quoting a superintendent in Hidalgo County in that era. So these little schools thrived on ranches and in urban spaces alike. And so before the expansion of the public school system, escuelitas were providing communities with a way to educate their children when there were no other options in a lot of cases. The curriculum consisted of Spanish literacy, literature, math, science, arts and crafts, and even things like PE sometimes. And after the proliferation of public education, the type of escuelita often dictated the curriculum. So, but Spanish was always the language of instruction, like even into the 1950s. So you had informal escuelitas that could take place in someone's living room and might just simply focus on Spanish literacy and math. And then you had ones that were much more formal, such as those built by members of a community who would pool their resources together and hire a teacher often from Mexico to create this curriculum. And of these formal escuelitas, Colegio Altamirano was certainly the most famous in the Southwest. And it operated during the school day. It replaced the public school system up until the 6th grade. And so not only did these escuelitas provide ethnic Mexican communities with access to education before public schools were available, but they also continued to teach students about their native culture and language for decades after segregation was a cornerstone of public education. Next slide, please. So the escuelita that I'll be talking about, Colegio Altamirano, was located in Hebronville, which is in today Jim Hogg County, and that's where you see the red arrow right there. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, Colegio Altamirano was the most famous escuelita in Texas. It opened in 1897 in Hebronville, and at the time, Hebronville was located in Duval County. So in 1895, just a couple of years before it opened, Duval County was comprised of over 1,800 square miles of land, but it only had 18 public schools. So that's one school every 100 square miles. And all of these schools were ungraded, and there was only one of them was a high school. Hebronville didn't actually open its first public school until 1921. And it was the only school in town until 1911, and that's when the Catholic school opened, the Little Flower School. So in the face of the utter lack of educational opportunities, 6 members of the ethnic Mexican community pooled their resources to build their own schoolhouse and to hire a teacher from Mexico. And the teacher was actually the brother of one of the founders. Next slide, please. So in 1900, within a couple of years after the escuelita opened, there were about 404 people living in Hebronville. There were 65 children who were listed as being at school in the 1900 census. And of those 65, 49 of them are listed as not being able to speak Spanish. This is a photo from the school year 1899 to 1900, that academic year. And based on the names of the students in this photo, plus the work that I've done with the 1900 census, there were probably about 50 students enrolled at El Colegio, and about 40% of them boarded with another family. So about 40% of them, their families didn't live in Hebronville, but they boarded with another family that did, so that they would be able to attend. So all this is to say is that when El Colegio first opened, the majority of the children living in the area attended this school. Next slide, please. So this photo here is from 1911, and the teacher who's seated right there in front of the chalkboard, her name was Emilia Davila. And so Davila was born in 1885 in Saltillo, Coahuila, and she was a graduate of the Teachers College there. She taught at El Colegio for over 30 years, so from 1910 to 1916, and then again from 1930 to about 1955. And in those intervening years, she taught in the public school system in Saltillo, where she helped organize teachers into a union. So during the early part of her teaching career, the teaching profession was going through a major transformation in Mexico and in Texas, but for our purposes here, South Texas. So it's becoming professionalized. And in Mexico and South Texas in particular, women teachers, one of the things that I argue is that they embodied what it meant to be a modern woman of the borderlands, that they were educated, independent, and ambitious. They were community and intellectual leaders. And so in this photo, Davila is about 26 years old, and every living former student at El Colegio today studied with her. Next slide, please. So Davila taught 6 different grades in multiple subjects, and the only textbook she used was like a small book of poems. She herself created a lot of the materials that the students needed. Students took oral exams in front of large crowds at school artistic and literary festivals that she organized at the end of every semester. Multiple former students of Davila still have their old report cards and even tuition receipts, which tell us the subjects that she taught, as well as how much their families paid for them to attend. So some of these records on this slide here, in the 1930s and the 1940s, she taught Spanish, math, science, geography, Mexican history, drawing, calligraphy, singing, exercise, manual trades, behavior, and conduct. And in 1939, families paid $1 a month, which equates to $22.80 today. Her former students vividly remember her passionate lectures on Mexican history, her rigorous math lessons, and her high expectations for their behavior. She was very strict and did not hesitate to spank students or even slap them if she caught them cursing. They also remember her expectations for keeping themselves and the environment clean. Next slide, please. Antonio Gonzalez recalls everything was from pure respect. You had to keep yourself clean too, and that's what I liked about her. You were poor, whatever clothes, but clean. La Prensa in the 1930s reported that she was, quote, a true intellectual mother of the children of Hebronville, not only because she was an excellent teacher, but because of the many ways she contributed to the Hebronville community. Next slide, please. So in 1931, Mexican Americans in Hebronville organized a local LULAC council, and the Hebronville News covered its founding. Many of the council members were graduates of El Colegio, and some of them were children of El Colegio's founders. Additionally, some of the members of the LULAC council were also members of the board for the Escuelita, and they sent their children to study with Davila instead of sending them to the public school. And Davila, though she continued to run the Escuelita, to use Spanish as the language of instruction, and to focus on Mexican history, literature, and poetry, she supported this LULAC council. So in 1932, the Hebronville Council hosted the LULAC State Convention, and they organized various fundraisers to pay for it. One of these fundraisers was the production of the play, The Flower of the Day, and Emilia Davila directed it. So though it was a fundraiser for the council, a portion of the proceeds went to El Colegio. And alongside this LULAC organizing in the 1930s, the Escuelita maintained strong enrollment. So this photo pictured here next to the newspaper article is from the 1930s. And there are about 45 children in the photo. And she remained the only teacher of this one-room schoolhouse. Next slide, please. There were many other ways that she was a leader in her community, though. She advocated for a public library years before the Jim Hogg County Public Library opened in 1936. And this is a photo of the of the building that was constructed then, the library. And after it opened, she regularly donated Spanish language reading materials for children and adults. In the early 1940s, she hosted Spanish story time during National Book Week. And during this time, she also organized her students to plant and maintain a garden in the town's plaza. And this is like the 1930s during the Great Depression. So current residents believe that the trees in the plaza may still be the same ones that Davila planted. And the Hebronville librarian wrote that she was, quote, one of the most civic-minded residents of this town. But beyond her work as a teacher, she was also like a social worker for her students. In the late 1930s, cases of smallpox increased in Hebronville. And Beatriz Gonzalez remembers that in the early 1940s, Davila herself administered smallpox vaccinations to all of the students in her class. And during Christmas, she cut down, every year she would cut down a salt cedar tree. And this is what it looks like. I didn't know, I had to look it up. So I thought I would include it just in case. So she would cut down a salt cedar tree, which is actually an invasive species that grew all over the area. And she put it up in the classroom, decorate it, and then make sure to have enough presents underneath the tree for each student in her class. And Diana Garza Valdez remembers that she would draw names, and when it was your turn, you could pick a gift. And then the final picture is of a purse that she gave to Beatriz Gonzalez. Next slide, please. In 2024, I had the privilege of receiving the Voces Oral History Collaborative Fellowship from the Center for Mexican American Studies and the Voces Oral History Center at UT Austin. And we conducted 14 oral history interviews with former students of El Colegio. And the fellowship provided all the resources for us to do this work. And so a lot of what I've talked about today comes from these interviews, as well as the historic research, the research that I've done. And so these interviews have provided so much rich information about the daily routines of the school, the impact that Davila had on the students' lives. And all of these interviews are housed at the Voces Oral History Collection at the Benson Library at UT Austin. And so we're going to see a short clip from Beatriz Barrera Gonzalez. She's 93 and attended El Colegio for 3 years in the late 1930s and the 1940s. And she clearly remembers the strong impression that Davila's lessons had on her. Next slide, please.
And then after lunch, we would come. Now that time she rang a bell and we had to climb steps, wooden steps. We went in, you took your seat, and then it was time for calisthenics. You stood up to the side of that side and this side, and then we went like, this, and, doing exercises because we were after lunch, and she was going to speak. She was going to teach us, I guess, history or whatever subject. I guess she wanted us to be awake because, you get sleepy. And then I remember put like this, like you had a basket, stretching, like you picking grapes or apples. Remember that.
That was one of the
That was
exercises?
after lunch all the time. And then she would go ahead and speak. The things that I remember was when she spoke about the whales. Oh, I just couldn't get over that one. I'd never seen a river or a sea or an ocean, but the fact that she talked about the whales and being mamíferas. Mamífera means mammals. Well, I knew about mammals. I was raised among everything, the goats and the sheep and the cows and the dogs and the cats, everything was a mammal. So we were, it was nothing new to us. But to see, she described that humongous thing about the size of the school building, and I can see that thing breastfeeding at something out there in the ocean.
That was Beatriz. I love you, Beatriz.
She had a lot to
So
do with
the next slide, this is,
great influence
we'll listen.
on my part. She was a disciplinarian, but then she was patient. She was the essence of a tremendous teacher, if one could say that. Emilia Davila. If she could only, there have been some times, I guess, she would turn in a grave with some of us as the things that we ended up doing as former students. But overall, we became what she taught us and what she shared with us. And she was a great lady. I owe her a great deal. I never forget. She would say, one of these days, young men, young girls, you will appreciate what I'm trying to teach you. She was right.
Yeah.
She was right.
So this was Homero Martinez. He's a descendant of one of El Colegio's founders. We were able to interview him and his brother El Mundo. Homero attended El Colegio in the late 40s and early 50s. And in this clip here, he really summed up a lot of the feelings that many of the interviewees, had for Davila. Next slide, please. And so Davila retired in the mid-1950s, and within a couple of years, El Colegio closed. As more and more families opted to send their children to the public school beginning in first grade, instead of sending them to the Colegio first and then having them transfer. So attendance dropped drastically. The school ended up closing officially in 1958. And after her retirement, Davila traveled between Hebronville and Saltillo and eventually settled with her niece down in the Rio Grande Valley, where she died in 1979 at the age of 93. And her body was taken to Hebronville, where many of her former students served as pallbearers. And she's buried in the Garza family plot in Hebronville. Next slide, please. And since fall of 2021, I've been working with the Jim Hogg County Historical Commission and the Museum Foundation of Hebronville to apply for a historical marker for El Colegio. And we learned in February 2022, that our application was approved. The unveiling ceremony was in May of this year, and it was a beautiful sight to see these former students walk up to the marker, and they were the ones that pulled the black veil down. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Wow, wow. Who knew we have this amazing history in South Texas, and yet it's not done. There's more history to share today. Okay, so who's going to be next? All right, Laura. Okay, so Laura, I think we practiced beforehand, so feel free to share when you're ready.
Okay. So the title of my talk is Mexican American Public School Teachers in the Early 20th Century. And one of the reasons I wanted to go next is because my work really balances, in some ways, the work that Professor Barragán Goetz has been doing in Texas. I study teachers in Arizona, and I study them in the public schools. And one of the things that she and I have discovered over the course of the last decade in this work is that these women, whether they were teaching in the public schools or the private schools, really had, in some ways, the same goal to educate children, to uplift their communities, and to create or fulfill the kinds of dreams that parents had for their children in these decades. I'm going to talk a little bit about the time period between 1930 and 1970. But to set a context for you, I'd like to begin by sharing a map with you. So this map shows you all of the states in the United States that had segregated schools for Mexican American children. You'll notice that the states go from the American South, Mississippi, all the way up to Washington State. What this tells us is that Mexican Americans were seen as non-white people by the US government, by many of these states, by Anglo-Americans that lived in these communities with them. So at the same time that we have Jim Crow in place, the separation of Blacks and whites in the American South, we also have the separation of Mexicans from ethnic Mexicans from whites and Blacks in these communities. If you go far west, the communities are multiracial. So we began to see Mexican American children separated from Japanese American children or Chinese American children and African American children, as well as white children. And Native American children were taught in federal boarding schools for the most part, or day schools on the reservation. So they themselves were also segregated. This is the context that teachers are entering when they began to apply for jobs as public school teachers in any of these states, but particularly in the Southwest. I do my work on Arizona, and Arizona, in fact, has built its public school system much earlier than the state of Texas. It passed its first law in 1870, and that law created a pathway for establishing schools through the counties. So public schools through counties would be funded based on tax dollars, and parents living within 2 miles of a school could create a school district. So there were a number of schools that emerged, some of them created by Mexican American families, some of them created by Euro-American families in the state of Arizona between 1870 and 1900. One of the women who benefited from this educational experience is this woman here, Maria Urquidez. And Maria Urquidez is a native of Tucson, Arizona. She was born there, comes from a family of both Mexican and Spanish heritage that also had lived in the region for generations. And she was the first child in her parents' household to complete high school and then to go on to college. Her parents made a really big deal about this idea of going to college, and she had to ask for permission. And her parents agreed to send her to the Tempe State Teachers College, also known as the Tempe Normal School, and today known as Arizona State University, because her cousins were also attending that particular institution. At Arizona State, Urquidez earned a gold medal, a valedictory medal for her achievement as an academic student, but she was also very talented, both in singing, and she eventually would actually sing on radio broadcasts in Arizona, and then also as an athlete, and for many years taught student play because of this emphasis. And you can see here all of the different clubs that she participated in. I think one of the most striking for her was the one listed at the very bottom, the Interracial Club. In the 1920s, Arizona State admitted for the first time Black students. And Urquidez was invited by the president of the university to help form an interracial club, bringing white, Black, and Mexican students together to create a kind of social life that would help them integrate the university at the time. This becomes a huge influence in Maria Urquidez's life. And I'll talk a little bit about that influence as we get deeper into her story. I'm going to use her as an example of the trajectory that many Mexican American teachers pursued in the time period. One of the things I mentioned to you a second ago was that there's this broad network of Mexican schools. And so because of that, Mexican American women and men who earned a college degree and teaching certification could apply for school teaching positions anywhere in the United States, but specifically in their home state. Most of them wanted to stay home. And those local school districts could decide where they would place these teachers. And one of the most notable trends that I discovered in my work in Arizona was that Mexican American teachers hit glass ceilings. School districts were unlikely to hire them, particularly in the larger metro areas. To give you an example, in Phoenix in 1930, there were 292 school teachers and only one was Mexicana. There were no Mexican Americans ever hired in that school district before 1928. In Tucson, Maria's hometown, the odds were a little better, but even there, amongst elementary school teachers, 158 total, including 6 Mexicanas. So the likelihood of Mexican American college graduates receiving employment was very, very slim. And as a result, they pursued work in smaller communities, rural communities across the state of Arizona. There were some, like Maria Urquidez, who were able to get employed in places like Tucson, but that kind of employment came as a result of family connections. And so in her case, her father was very well known, a founder of the Alianza Hispanoamericana. He was also very involved in politics. And so because of who she is descended from, she's able to get a job in Tucson, and she teaches there for the next 50 years. Urquidez, like Profesora Davila, also took on this role of a social worker. I call these teachers teacher advocates. Between 1928 and 1944, essentially between across the Great Depression into World War II, Maria taught full-time at a school in Tucson that was nearly 100% Mexican American. And she also, after school, volunteered for Catholic Social Services, helping families get resettled, helping families deal with whatever kind of financial issues they were confronting at that time in the midst of the Great Depression. This particular emphasis for her became her sort of the driving force behind her professional life. She joined a number of civic organizations such as the YWCA, and worked with Euro-American, Anglo-American women to help convince them to support full-time community centers like this one for Mexican people in the 1930s. This particular center, which is known today as Oury Park, was pretty close to the school that she taught at. And so the children would have opportunities to go there after school. Their parents would have opportunities during the day, also after school and in the evening, to take courses such as English or needlepoint. And they also use these community centers as ways to help support the needs of the local community. Urquidez's work in this time period becomes critical because she learns the system, how to work as a teacher in a public school district that is predominantly white and segregated. And she also begins to come into herself as a professional. So while she is teaching over the course of these years, she's developing this really wide range of relationships across culture, across race, and across class that will help her as she moves into her career in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and begins to challenge the idea of Mexican American segregation. In the late 1940s, she actually joins an interracial group of supporters in Arizona who are attempting to desegregate the public schools. And as a result of this effort, which is multiracial, Black, Latino, I should say Anglo-American, also Jewish community and Catholic community and Mormon community supported this particular effort to basically destroy segregation in Arizona, particularly after World War II. They called for a referendum. The referendum passes in the state and it gets added to the ballot. The Alianza supports this initiative along with the teachers' unions. By this time, Urquidez herself is a well-known advocate in the teachers' union and actually becomes president of the Tucson Public School Teachers Union. The referendum unfortunately fails, but what we learn is that Urquidez is on the cutting edge here, along with other Mexican Americans of her generation who are beginning to challenge segregation, inequality, and demand civil rights, not only for themselves, but their communities at large. By the 1960s, Urquidez is at the forefront of conversations about bilingual education. And some people in Arizona argue that she is the mother of bilingual education. She, in fact, helps organize a group of teachers who go on a massive tour with the support of the National Education Association, and they conduct assessments of Mexican American schooling in all of the 4 border states. They interview hundreds of Mexican American teachers about the children they teach, their issues around language, and they put together a report that becomes the foundation for the legislative call for bilingual education. That particular report is what launches Maria Urquidez into a national arena as a public figure, as an expert on teaching Mexican American children. She had established that reputation even a little bit earlier. In 1963, she was the only woman who was appointed to the Kennedy Viva Kennedy campaign, organized by the Democratic Party. Urquidez would go on to teach throughout the 70s and eventually retire in the 80s. And her significance, not only within Arizona, but in the Southwest as an important Mexican-American figure, is emphasized in particular by her relationship to the famous singer Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt was also a native of Tucson. Her family, the Ronstadts, knew the Urquidez, and when Linda Ronstadt produced her 1987 album Canciones de mi Padre, she kicked off that concert tour in Tucson, and the one person she recognized in the audience was her teacher, Maria Urquidez. Maria's life actually is very similar to other students in the region. I just want to show you a few others before I end here. And do this very quickly so that we have time for Gonzalo and also questions. One point I wanted to emphasize as well is that Maria continued her public service work. And this is an example of the League of Mexican American Women in Tucson who raised money for scholarships. You'll notice that Maria is standing, and the woman next to her is also a longtime teacher, Ida Celaya. And she taught also in the Tucson schools, as well as some of the Phoenix area schools from the 1910s into the 1960s. In the 1930s, we began to see a group of students matriculate into colleges and universities across the state of Arizona. There's Northern Arizona University, there's Arizona State in Phoenix, and then there's also the University of Arizona in Tucson. And we began to see trickles of Mexican American students entering college life on these campuses. And 2 of those figures are Maria Urias and Rosalia Ross Muñoz, who you see here. They will eventually teach in a Northern Arizona community, St. John's, and also the town of El Tule. And they're both located in Apache County, Arizona, along the New Mexico border. The settlement there is mostly Hispano descendant families. It's one of the few places that Maria Urias and Ross Muñoz, as he was known, were able to get jobs, as I mentioned to you earlier, because of that glass ceiling. They were able to recruit students from the college organizations they participated in, such as Los Conquistadores at Arizona State. Here's an example of a group of students from Arizona State who came to St. John's in the 1940s, specifically to teach in districts that had predominantly high Latino populations, Mexican descent populations in the region. Ross Muñoz, though, decides to leave the profession. And this is one difference between the men and the women pursuing educational careers. Women did not have opportunities beyond teaching or beyond teaching high school Spanish. Men, on the other hand, had opportunities at advancement through other kinds of institutions, like going on to graduate school or pursuing law school. And because of that gender divide, what we see is that a number of Mexican American men in the time period who become well-known attorneys or who become well-known school administrators are able to sort of jump into those professional posts because of gender and race working together. Here's another example. In the center, you see Ralph Estrada. He's a lead attorney and president of the Alianza Hispanoamericano by this time, but he was also a school teacher, and he also graduated from Arizona State University in the early 1920s. And to give you an example of the difference in the ways that men and women were paid in this time period, when Ralph Estrada graduated from college in 1923, he was paid $150 a month in his very first job in a small town in the Arizona foothills. Ida Celaya, who I mentioned to you earlier, had 5 years of teaching experience and was only being paid $144. So you can see simply in the way that the men and women are paid, that difference seems to be related to gender politics in the time period. Ross Muñoz's sister, Rebecca Muñoz, also becomes a well-known teacher, and she also becomes one of these figures who's known for teaching bilingual education. She actually teaches in the Phoenix Valley of the Sun in places like Mesa, Arizona, Webster School. And then shortly after getting married, she has a number of children, but then her husband unfortunately dies of cancer. And so she goes back into the classroom, and she moves with her husband initially to Los Angeles, where he's from, and they join the political scene there. And here she is being one of the very first teachers paid under a special Bilingual Education Act that Congressman Ed Roybal was able to convince Congress to pass in 1967. So you can see how the trajectory is very similar between Urquidez and subsequently the Muñoz children, all of them working with Mexican-American children, all of them using their Spanish language ability to educate these youth, and then all of them working with men who've had opportunity to become politicians and lawyers to change the ways that Mexican-American children are educated in public schools across the West. So I'll stop right there. If y'all have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about them. And I just want to point out that this particular image was sent to me by Rebecca Muñoz's son, Dr. Felix Gutierrez, who's a retired professor from the University of Southern California. So thank you, Dr. Gutierrez.
Wow, thank you. We're going to take questions and comments at the end. So if you haven't already put your question or comment in the chat, go ahead and do that. And we have another presentation from Dr. Gonzalo Guzmán.
Can you all see this? Oh, sorry. All right. Can you all hear me?
You got it.
Oh, sorry about that. All right. All right. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I just want to say that I was inspired by the work of Laura and Philis to do this. And I'm going to focus on 3 educators, all from Wyoming, and try to frame this under a discussion of like a long Chicano movement. So yeah, here we go. First of all, to get started, I just want to remind people that where Wyoming is, and also to name the 3 locations that I will be discussing when I highlight the 3 educators. One is Riverton, Manville, and Torrington. During my talk, when I focus on them. But I also just want to mention that when we've talked about Texas and Arizona, and usually when people talk about Wyoming, generally Wyoming is kind of known for its landscape or its environment as opposed to its social history. And this is not just the issue of Mexican American history, but in general, when people think about social history, particularly educational history, rarely does Wyoming come up. However, I also want to put this in a larger framework of like, where do the three educators that I'm going to discuss fall in the larger history of Mexican-American educational history in Wyoming? And generally, the way in which the discussion of educational history in Wyoming is currently constructed, and I'll blame myself too as being part of this construction, is one that generally talks about the education of Mexican Americans, generally during the discussion of, racial segregation, are one that has really focused on education being a means of basically making Mexican Americans outside of the public. So for instance, one of the images that you see from the 1930s, which is actually titled "Strangers Within Our Gates," comes from a federal report in Wyoming during the 1930s of an Americanization class that's actually targeting Mexican Americans. And they're actually going to the homes and doing a lesson. So I'm just setting this as the stage of the way in which the common discourse of educational history has discussed Mexican Americans. And also to highlight how the discussion of the three educators fits into that, but also forces us to rethink that narrative in more of a civil rights discourse. So I just want to give a shout out that this is building off the work directly of our two previous speakers, Philis and Laura, and that this is really speaking or really demanding that we start talking about this in a larger discussion of a Mexican-American civil rights movement, because everything that we've talked about predates, right, the late 1960s, mostly. Yeah, so my first educator that I'm going to talk to is actually someone who's not named. But I'm going to talk about them as a way of naming them. And here you go. So the first educator is actually a teaching assistant, so like an instructional assistant. And here is a picture of her teaching a class, telling a story to a group of white kids who are working, who are relief workers during the Great Depression. They're WPA workers. And the WPA is Work Progress Administration. And this is in Riverton, Wyoming. Although she's not named, she is a high school graduate, and you see this report is actually from a federal reporter who is visiting Wyoming and documenting what Wyoming is doing with the federal relief funds that they're getting from the Great Depression. And so one of the people they decide to highlight is this Mexican-American girl who just graduated high school. And she's a teaching assistant. The reason why I want to highlight this is because I think this is pretty incredible, because this is 1936. And at the very same time that we have a Mexican-American teacher teaching predominantly white children in Riverton, Wyoming, in other communities across the state, they're actively using relief funds to create segregated schools in Wyoming at the same time that specifically target Mexican Americans. So when I saw this federal documentation, like, I had to do a double take, because I literally couldn't believe this, because given what was happening in Wyoming at the time, where there was this heightened anti-Mexican sentiment, deportation, cutting Mexicans off of relief, actively trying to kick them out of the state of Wyoming, you also have this educational moment where Mexican Americans are still becoming teachers, still creating their space in educational settings. And here is an actual example of this is happening. So I thought this was pretty incredible. And although they do not actually name who this person is, what I think is also important is it's naming the fact that Mexican Americans are creating educational spaces at this moment of when there was this active move, not just in Wyoming, but in the entire United States, to take away their civil rights. And Mexican Americans are still creating their own spaces. The next educator I'm going to highlight is Trevino Joe Sandoval, who also goes by T. Joe Sandoval. And he's very interesting because he actually went to school originally in New Mexico, and ends up moving to Wyoming to attend high school in Rawlins, Wyoming. And the picture you see before you is actually his high school yearbook. He went by Sandy. I'm not sure why, but that it's in the yearbook. And the reason why T. Joe Sandoval is so important is because he would actually end up going to the University of Wyoming and getting his degree in administration, educational administration. And his master's thesis would actually become one of the first, if not the first, major historical study, not just on the experience of Mexican Americans in Wyoming, but the history of Mexican Americans in the state. Actually, the pictures you see before you actually come from his master's thesis, and were actually critical to my own work. My family is actually from Moreland, Wyoming, and this is actually one of the few photos that are in existence of this school at the time. So he ended up going to the University of Wyoming, but his story doesn't end there. After he gets his degree, he actually becomes a superintendent of an entire school district in Wyoming in the late 1940s. And there's the actual superintendent's report that you can see. It says T. Joe Sandoval, superintendent. And it's a very small school district called Manville in Wyoming. And the photo you see here is actually with T. Joe Sandoval with actually his family. And one of the kids in the photo actually has a shirt that says Manville, which is speaking directly to the school district that he was the superintendent of. So I bring this up to show that, in Wyoming, that not only are Mexican Americans becoming, teaching assistants, teachers graduating from the University of Wyoming, but also, before the 1950s are becoming superintendents of school districts where they may be, in many cases, the only Mexican American family. And this is all before the 1960s. But his story doesn't end in Wyoming. Actually, he ends up leaving Wyoming and ends up moving to Salt Lake City, and ends up continuing his work with Mexican American education. And he actually ends up working for the Utah Education Association during the late 1960s and early 70s, where his focus is on recruiting Mexican American and bilingual teachers at the time. And I will end the story with T. Joe Sandoval because he actually writes the introduction to one of the first books of Mexican Americans in Utah, called A Utah Hispanic History. So not only is his story important to Wyoming, but it also is linking to a larger story of impacting the Intermountain West with his work on Utah. And the last educator from Wyoming that I'm going to focus and end on today is Raymond Silva. Raymond Silva is an educator who, grows up in Torrington, Wyoming, and he is born in the 1920s, and he attends Torrington, that has a segregated school for Mexican Americans. And here is a profile of it in a newspaper in Torrington, Wyoming. And at this time, it's called a Columbia School, but it's specifically for Spanish American or Mexican American pupils. And I highlight this school because this is the school that Raymond Silva will actually teach at. And so here's a picture of Raymond Silva when 1939, he's 10, of him living in Torrington. And he would teach at a segregated school in Torrington. And a class photo is right next to him. However, Raymond Silva would actually also attend the University of Wyoming, where he would get a degree in education and also get his master's degree in Spanish. Here you have him, his photo from the University of Wyoming yearbook, but also a yearbook photo of him when he would teach at a high school in Wyoming. But one thing I do want to highlight about Raymond Silva is that what is very interesting about his story is that he would actually teach at that segregated Mexican school that I showed a picture of earlier in Torrington, and from 1952 to 1954. And the only reason why that segregated school closes is because of the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of the Education. So not only does Raymond Silva, get degrees from the University of Wyoming, he ends up teaching at this segregated Mexican school in Wyoming during the time of desegregation. And I just find this as a very fascinating story, given the fact that he actually lives through this desegregation moment in his teaching, and actually ends up teaching family members too at that school. However, his story does not end in Wyoming. He actually ends up moving to California and teaching in the Anaheim school district as a middle school teacher, and he also becomes a counselor. In his education career ends actually in California, where he retires as an educator in the 1990s. However, here's a recent photo of Raymond Silva from 2023 when he just turned 95. And I just want to acknowledge that long legacy that he has. And I will finally end with this, that speaking of impact, this actually comes from Wyoming, from Mills, Wyoming, that actually recently in 2023 actually acknowledged the educational career of Raymond Silva and his impact on Wyoming. And I end with this because this speaks to just the larger legacy, or educational genealogy, that the impact that all these educators have had in Wyoming, in this larger legacy. And I'll end with there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guzmán. What amazing presentations. The three of you have just really done this inspiring work documenting how Mexican Americans made spaces for Mexican American educational access and opportunities, of course, not only in the Southwest, but beyond. And of course, that connects dots between education, labor history, and civic activism, all of which are such critical civil rights issues. So we have a number of comments from the audience, and I just want to remind folks that you're welcome to go ahead and put a question or a comment in the chat. One of our guests tonight is the great-grandniece of Eleuterio Escobar, and I'm sure many folks have heard of Mr. Eleuterio Escobar, who has a school named after him here in San Antonio, the founder of La Liga Pro Defensa Escolar, a gentleman who saw that there were kids on the street in the daytime, and he was like, why aren't these kids in school? And in fact, the reason they weren't in school was because the segregated Mexican schools were already overcrowded. not all the kids who even wanted to go, or the parents who wanted their kids to go, they couldn't get them a seat. They couldn't get them a spot in the school. And so was this by design so that those kids would be forced into the labor market? Well, I won't answer that. But we have this wonderful comment from Heather, who's with us from that. And she says, let me see if I can actually put it up on the screen. Will that happen? Yeah, there we go. This is so interesting because so much of what is written about this period focuses only on difficulty getting migrant farming families to send their children to school. But it's very obvious that Mexican families were going above and beyond to, and I'm sorry, I don't think it will all fit there, but so I'll just tell you the rest of it, to educate their children a much broader story than is typically portrayed. If anybody wants to comment on that.
That's exactly true. Exactly true. I mean, one of the things that's amazing about the three of us is that we've had an opportunity to learn from other scholars in the last 40 years who've developed the field of Mexican American history. And because of their work, we're able to do this deeper dive into the history of education and Mexican American education in particular. And recuperating those stories, particularly in the way that Philis has done, has become essentially our mission, whether we're in Arizona or Wyoming or Nebraska or Texas.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something to Laura's comment is that 1,000,000% yes. And also all three of us have not just stopped with archival research, but all of us have interviewed people who were there or descendants of people who were there and engaged in community work to help communities recover and preserve this past, this history. And so like my research on Emilia Dávila and Colegio Altamirano started with my first book, but once that came out, that I was able to establish even stronger connections with people in Hebronville and was able to continue it even more.
Let me share another comment here. My grandfather attended the Wellhausen Mexican School in Cotulla, Texas, and had LBJ as a teacher/principal. It's fascinating to hear what else was happening before, during, and after that time. And I certainly want to just acknowledge how important it is that, for example, Dr. Guzmán's work is helping us see it's not even just the Southwest. So the time period is much wider than maybe we had thought or assumed, but also the geographic reach. That map that Dr. Muñoz showed was just so fantastic to show us where all of these Mexican schools were and where were we, because obviously we were there if we had schools there, but we were actively saying, we're not just here to work, we also want our kids to go to school. Let's see. I also, here's a comment. As an educator, I'm inspired by the groundwork laid out for me and others to practice our craft, the impact these giants have made for their communities and a greater movimiento. No wonder Texas is fearful of educators who also practice advocacy. And isn't that remarkable that all of these teachers that you've talked about, they were also involved in civic organizations. So they're active and playing a role in these students' lives through teaching in the classroom, but they were also outside of school, active in other aspects to try to continue to improve life in other areas. Those civic organizations are so critical, and it's wonderful that you've been able to parse that out in the research you've been doing.
You know, one of the things that's critically important is that teachers were perceived as the most educated people in their communities. So these young men and women did incredible work for all of the generations in those communities, not only teaching the children, but helping parents after school, helping parents on weekends, and helping families, whether they were their own families or strangers to them, but doing it in the name of family, in the name of community, in the name of Improving Mexican American experience in the United States.
We do have a question about differences between educational opportunities for Mexican American or Mexican populations in places like Arizona and New Mexico versus Texas and California. Our commenter feels like maybe Arizona and New Mexico had better opportunities or more opportunities. Have you seen a difference like that?
No, I think that we can't answer that because the answer is inconclusive. We don't know how many teachers of Mexican American heritage or ethnic Mexican heritage existed in California or Texas in this time period. I came to the topic because my great grandmother was a school teacher in Brownsville, Texas, where my family's from. So I know that there were considerable numbers of Mexican American teachers in the region, not only in the Mexican sponsored schools, but also in the public schools. We just haven't, as historians, had an opportunity to get there yet. I would say that they're all quite similar. I don't think that one community is outdoing the other. New Mexico was able to preserve the Spanish language longer. But they're all attempting to educate their children as best as possible and to send them to higher education. That's my take. Phyllis might have a different perspective. Gonzalo might have a different perspective too.
Well, in Texas, the Texas state constitution laid out a public school system for Black children and for white children. And because Mexican American children legally were supposed to be considered white, however, socially, they very much were not. Oftentimes you would have a Mexican ward school that only went up to like the 4th or the 5th grade, or there might be like a semi-integrated elementary school. But beyond that, Mexican children weren't permitted to go beyond the 5th grade because there was not an integrated middle school or high school. And most of people who were residents of Texas lived in rural areas, and that was a very common practice for rural areas, as opposed to places like San Antonio or Houston.
The teachers that you have uncovered, and I maybe have Dr. Guzmán answer this, those teachers that you've uncovered, are they people who, if you live in Wyoming and grow up in Wyoming, have you heard of them? Do you learn about them in school, or are these hidden figures that you've been excavating?
Oh no, they're not taught in school. I want to touch back to something that Laura mentioned, and this also comes about what Laura mentions in her book, Desert Dreams, about the difficulty of doing research is this lack of identifying, or this inconsistency of identifying who and who is not Mexican American at the time. So for instance, the unnamed teacher, Trevino and Raymond, never are they identified as Mexican or Mexican American, right? They either self-identify or they're just named in that narrative, right? So there's nothing else that's actually naming them as that. And that's the difficulty at the time of like not being named unless there's a story or there's something. So in that sense, I mean, Wyoming's barely teaching about that they even had segregated schools, right, in their system. Their motto is the equality state. They're trying to address that in some capacity, but in terms of like knowing about these educators, you mentioned hidden figures, and only recently have they been giving the proper spotlight that they have. But what also speaks to the fact that they are there, though, what I think is important. And if it's just, and yes, I just named 3, but no way are they the only 3, right? So I think there's that hope and that faith of doing this work that history provides, that like, if I was able to get this, just imagine what others can, and all the other voices that are there too that can be uncovered by this work.
There's so much more to do. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I did want to ask Phyllis a question. You mentioned that at the Hebronville School, it was $1, which was approximately $22 now. And I wanted to ask you if any of the people that you interviewed talked about how their parents paid for it. Was this something that was just a financial priority, and so they figured it out, or was it a struggle? Did they have to have fundraisers? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so based on the interviews, I would say all of the above. So the student body was comprised of like wealthy landowners who lived in the surrounding area. The Martinez family, one of the founders of the school, was a huge landowner, wealthy landowner in the area, but he also paid tuition for the children of like vaqueros, ranch hands, people who worked on his ranch. He paid the tuition for their children to attend the colegio as well. Beatriz Gonzalez, that we saw the clip from, every morning she or her grandmother would milk their family cow, and then once a week she would take a couple of pints of milk to Señorita Davila in exchange for tuition. Mm-hmm. So that's how she was able to go to the school. So I think there were very creative ways that people found to pay the tuition, in addition to just being able to have the income to afford it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's see. I don't see any other audience questions. If you have one, go ahead and stick it in there. Otherwise, what a treat, what a pleasure to speak with all of you. And just I want to thank you. Multiple people have thanked you in the comments for your dedication to this research. Multiple people want you to know how much they appreciate this. We've got some retired teachers with us. We've got some current teachers with us. And they're just expressing how grateful they are to you for this research, as am I. I think that the work that you're doing is helping us better understand just how long we have wanted our community to be educated, and you know, this is not something that was just well, if we can afford it, we'll send you to school. But in fact, that people were really trying to figure it out, right? They were trying to figure it out. How can we get our kids educated? How can we get schools for our kids? So this is important work. And I think it's hard to not connect the dots between the work you're doing and concerns some of us have today about educational access and telling full stories of our history. So I just really do want to share my gratitude to you for the work you're doing. And with that, if it doesn't look like any other questions have come in. So I want to thank our guests. I want to thank all the people who tuned in tonight. And I want to remind you that if you enjoyed tonight's program, we've always got more programs coming down the pipeline. Up next, we are going to have an event here in San Antonio on July 12th. Let me stick this image up here. We're having a cosecha. We're inviting folks to come into the MACRI Visitor Center. You can bring photographs, newspaper clippings, letters, flyers, things that you might have that are connected to Mexican American civil rights history. We'll scan them for you. We can provide digital copies so you can share those things with your family and friends, but also we will be building an archive, an online archive, with the goal of creating an easy to access place for kids, middle school, high schoolers, to find primary resources on Mexican American civil rights history. So help us out. Come and see us on July 12th. And we'll be doing that from 10 to noon. And then there's always more events. So if you go to our website, somosmacri.org, you can find a full calendar of upcoming events. So thank you so much for coming back for another edition with the education historians. And we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.